In March 1917, Nicholas II signed his abdication in a railway carriage parked on a siding near Pskov. He used a pencil. Around him, his generals had already informed him, one by one, that they would not suppress the uprising in Petrograd. There was no one left to call. The Romanov dynasty, which had governed Russia for 304 years, ended in an afternoon, not in battle, not in a palace, in a stopped train, with a pencil, surrounded by silence. The collapse of Imperial Russia is often told as a story about revolution. It is more accurately a story about a system that had spent 2 centuries accumulating power without accumulating the capacity to use it wisely. By the time the crisis arrived, the institutions that should have absorbed the shock had been deliberately weakened by the very throne they existed to protect. The Romanovs had not always governed from isolation. Peter the Great, who seized effective control in 1696, was one of the most aggressively self-transforming rulers in European history. He traveled to Western Europe in disguise to study shipbuilding. He dismantled the old Muscovite aristocracy and rebuilt the Russian state around a table of ranks that rewarded competence over birth. He was brutal, relentless, and genuinely effective. He understood that Russia's survival as a major power required it to absorb what it did not yet know. That instinct to look outward, to measure the gap honestly, and to close it did not survive him as institutional culture. It survived as imperial mythology. Later Romanov rulers invoked Peter's memory without inheriting his method. The willingness to be honestly wrong, which had been the engine of his reforms, became, in his successors, a performance of strength that could not admit weakness. Catherine the Great maintained the outward forms of Enlightenment engagement. She corresponded with Voltaire, patronized the arts, and articulated liberal principles with genuine sophistication. She also expanded serfdom, crushed Pugachev's rebellion with systematic violence, and governed through a court culture in which access to her favor was the primary currency of Russian political life. The tension between enlightened self-presentation and autocratic practice was not hypocrisy exactly. It was a structural feature of Russian imperial governance that each subsequent reign inherited and deepened. By the 19th century, Russia faced a version of the same modernization problem that was destroying the Qing, but with a crucial difference. Russian rulers knew the West existed as a competitive threat. They had fought Napoleon. They had lost the Crimean War to British and French forces in 1856, a defeat that exposed the technological and organizational gap between Russia and Western Europe in terms that were impossible to ignore. Alexander II responded by emancipating the serfs in 1861, in what he called a reform from above before reform from below became inevitable. The emancipation was real. It was also incomplete, hedged by redemption payments that kept former serfs economically bound to the land they had been legally freed from. It satisfied neither the conservatives who feared disruption nor the reformers who recognized it as insufficient. And it produced exactly the kind of political middle ground that pleases no constituency and resolves nothing reform as gesture rather than transformation. Alexander II was assassinated in 1881 by revolutionary populists, killed by the second bomb thrown at him on a St. Petersburg street. The irony was precise and devastating. He had signed documents that morning extending limited political consultation rights. His death handed power to Alexander III, who interpreted the assassination not as evidence that reform had been too slow, but as evidence that it had gone too far. He reversed his father's liberalizing measures, intensified censorship, and rebuilt the secret police infrastructure with renewed conviction. Russia's window for managed constitutional evolution narrowed sharply and did not reopen. Nicholas II inherited this consolidated autocracy in 1894, 26 years old and profoundly unprepared. His own diary entry on the day his father died recorded his fear with disarming honesty. He wrote that he did not know how to rule. He had not been trained for it. His father had kept him away from state business, apparently believing there was time. There was not. What is striking about Nicholas in the voluminous historical record of his reign is not his cruelty, but his limitation. He was a devoted father, a loyal husband, and a man of personal religious sincerity. He was also constitutionally unable to delegate authority to people more capable than himself, temperamentally resistant to information that contradicted his preferred understanding of events, and governed by a mystical conviction in his divine appointment that functioned in practice as a closed loop. God had made him Tsar. Russia loved its Tsar. Evidence to the contrary was the product of enemies, agitators, or misunderstanding. This closed loop had a physical manifestation. The court at Tsarskoye Selo, where Nicholas and Alexandra retreated increasingly from Petrograd, operated as a self-contained world. Access was managed, reports were filtered. Ministers who delivered unwelcome assessments found themselves replaced with ministers who understood what was expected of them. Sergei Fichte, the finance minister who had driven Russia's industrial expansion in the 1890s and who negotiated the peace with Japan in 1905, was sidelined and dismissed. Pyotr Stolypin, whose agricultural reforms were perhaps the last serious attempt at stabilizing the empire from within, was assassinated in 1911 in a Kiev theater in front of Nicholas by a man with connections to the secret police that were never fully investigated. By 1914, the people closest to the throne were not its most competent advisors. They were its most obedient ones. The decision to enter the First World War was not irrational by the standards of the moment. Every major European power made the same catastrophic miscalculation about duration and cost. But Russia was uniquely ill-equipped to absorb what followed. The army was vast and brave and poorly supplied. The rail network could not move material efficiently to the front. The command structure was plagued by aristocratic appointments that prioritized rank over ability. By 1915, Nicholas made the decision that would seal his fate. He personally assumed command of the army, placing himself at the front while leaving the government in Petrograd under the effective influence of Alexandra, who was herself under the influence of Rasputin. This arrangement was not the cause of Russia's collapse. It was a symptom of how completely the center had lost its grip on institutional reality. The ministers in Petrograd changed with bewildering frequency 4 prime ministers in the final year alone. The Duma, the limited parliamentary body created after the 1905 revolution, warned repeatedly that the government was losing the population. The warnings went unheard or were dismissed as political maneuvering. When bread shortages triggered street protests in Petrograd in late February 1917, the Tsar's initial response was to order the garrison to suppress them. The garrison refused, or joined them. The distinction, by that point, barely mattered. The army that might have protected the throne had been bled white at the front, commanded by men appointed for loyalty rather than competence, fighting a war whose costs had long since exceeded any conceivable benefit that ordinary Russians could identify. Across collapsing empires, historians identify a consistent pattern in the final phase. The institutions that exist to carry information from the periphery to the center stop functioning honestly. Not because they are destroyed, but because the center has spent years signaling that honest information is unwelcome. The system learns to tell the throne what the throne wants to hear. And then, when a genuine crisis arrives, the throne has no accurate picture of what is actually happening and no remaining reserve of institutional trust with which to respond. Nicholas learned that his army would not fight for him, not from his generals' reports, but from the generals themselves, arriving at his railway carriage one by one to tell him it was over. By that point, it had been over for a long time. The paperwork simply hadn't caught up. A dynasty does not fall when it loses its last battle. It falls when the people who were supposed to warn it stop believing it was worth warning. Russia's last Tsar was not abandoned in a moment of crisis. He was abandoned across decades of accumulated distance from competence, from counsel, from the country he believed, with complete sincerity, that God had given him to protect. He signed his name in pencil. And the train stayed still.